Good day everyone and welcome to another vlog for the Exodus 7 to 12K JV project. Now as you can see, this little purple monkey is absolutely not part of Exodus, but it does serve to explain something God had me work on yesterday specifically, talking about animation in general as it relates to anime. Now anime has a bunch of stuff going on the screen at the exact same time, but they are generally at differing frame rates. Now, some of the reasons are purely because of the workflow. Actually, most of the reasons are purely because of the workflow. But one of the main reasons it has such varying frame rates is because of time constraints and budget. Now, because of time constraints and budget, they use various kinds of means in order to produce shots that would otherwise be technically impossible. For example, in a 2D space, you don't have much of a camera to work with. You have to draw everything as if there is a camera. So what they sometimes do is they use something like this, where they would do a whole frame that's a lot larger than what the camera does, but all it does is it's filling in the entire space where the camera will be going. So let's say in this case we had like this panning shot that goes, reveals Mordecai, So what they would do is they would animate him, his typical 12 frames per second or whatever the case might be for this situation. And then they would, in post-production, technically post-production, they would then move the frame across the image all the way up to his face right there. And then they would kind of stop there, or the shot will be a continuous movement of the camera and then transition to something else. So this allows them to use a lower frame rate while still being able to use a very smooth camera motion. Otherwise, it would be technically a nightmare. It would be absolutely a nightmare to try and animate it frame by frame without doing, the whole panning situation. So what we struggle with in 3D when it comes to these differing frame rates is a flicker problem. So let's get into that quickly. So this will be an example of a normal full animation at 30 frames per second, no trickery or whatever the case might be. As you can see, it's super smooth, very accurate. It doesn't really have that kind of feel that you're technically looking for when you're going for an anime look in 3D. This one, on the other hand, is what happens if you reduce your overall frame rate for the entire animation. This one runs at about 15 frames per second, possibly a little bit less. Not exactly sure what the stepped interpolation would do to it. My guess is if it's 2, it means 2 frames. But it does move a little bit slow for 15 frames per second. This looks more like 10 or so. And this is what happens if you don't do what I'm about to show you guys. If you only step your character, but you do not control your character's animation in relation to the camera. It flickers like crazy. Now the reason it flickers like crazy is because the camera is moving smoothly and the character is not. So what happens is it does this jiggle because the camera moves it back while it stutters, and it moves it forward, and the camera moves it back, and it moves forward, and the camera moves it back. So it's like this constant struggle to cooperate with the camera. But there is a solution in Blender to this. And here it is. So as you can see, the background moves perfectly smooth, and the 2D objects do not clash with the camera, but they do move at a different frame rate than the background does, which is what you typically find in an anime show. The difficulty with this is that whatever you want to give a different frame rate has to be separated out and rendered out with a mask. For example, let me show you what the project looks like for this. Okay, so here we have the normal full animation, which is what you're going to be rendering out, but you're not going to be rendering it out in the typical fashion. We are going to have to use the file output nodes in order to achieve this. So what you need to output is, for this basic scene, you're going to have to render out a freestyle mask. I call it a freestyle mask because it's on my 2D objects. They know that mask that separates them out. I did a video on compositing Toon shading with soft shadows. You can check that out in the description. It explains why I use a freestyle mask. Then we have freestyle objects, which is the color version of our 2D shapes. We have our clean background with absolutely no shadows on it. In this instance, there are some shadows still on it, but that's because of the environment reaction. It's something that unfortunately Blender doesn't really turn off. You can turn it off, but it ruins the effect. So I don't turn it off, and it's so subtle it doesn't matter. So anyway, moving on. You need a clean background. You need your shadows to be separated out. Now, one thing that I want to mention here is that the shadows on your 2D shapes are still there. They are not part of this shadow because this is the background layers shadows that we're looking for, not our 2D shapes shadows. So this has to be separated out. And then of course our ambient occlusion. This is optional if you actually have that turned on. I like turning it on because I noticed that in most of the paintings, the matte paintings for the backgrounds that they do in anime, they do have ambient occlusion painted in to some degree. So I do include it. It's up to you, but whatever. So you can see already we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 passes that has to be rendered out. I chose JPEG because it's smaller. Anyway, and it has nothing to do with the distribution format. So, okay, now I want to show you what this looks like in the VSE because that's where you combine it. So in the VSE, we're looking at our 5 strips added. Now on the first one, all we did is we used the mask, the freestyle mask, to mask our color footage so that it actually has a transparent look. So if I turn this back to replace, you can see that it has an alpha background. And this is our mask pass over here. So if I move this around, you can see that, there we go. You can see it doesn't respond correctly now. So if I move this, see? Okay, so that's pretty much the freestyle part of it. So whatever you do, you just set that to alpha over again. And of course, your background is your background. Just leave it as is. And then, of course, you have your shadows. Now, one thing that I've noticed is that when I rendered out the ambient occlusion, it was a smidge too dark for my taste. So what I did was I first multiplied the ambient occlusion over the normal shadow pass, and I reduced the opacity of that multiply. And then I grouped both and multiplied that over the background. So I want to show you what that looks like in the steps that it runs. So you can see we have our shadows active there. So this is our ambient occlusion. As you can see, it's multiplied over a normal shadow output, which is just this black and white render. And you can see that I can adjust my ambient occlusion over here. And of course, if I want the pair dark, lighter on the background, all I can do is just adjust the opacity over here. Now, what I want to show you quickly is you can see that there's a slight spot on the screen. Look at that spot over there. That's the monkey moving. It's part of the environment lighting's interaction. So it's so subtle, you're not going to notice it in the final animation if you put everything together. So it's not even worth messing with, seriously. Okay, so I'm just going to put this back to about 8.81 so that we have our shadows. As you can see, there are the shadows right there. And of course, now we just turn our characters back on as well. Now, what you saw is a controlled frame rate where the monkey's frame rate is less than the backgrounds. Now, the reason we can do this is because of what is known as a strobe feature under the filter set. settings. Oh, tongues are twisting this morning. Anyway, what I wanted to do yesterday is I wanted to use a driver to control this strobe for all the strips that have to work together. Your shadows and your characters usually move at the exact same frame rate so that they match up. I mean, it doesn't help that your character is moving at like 2 or 3 frames per second and your shadow is going at 30. I mean, it doesn't fit. It creates a very uneasy feeling. So anyway, so what we do is we animate the strobe feature. Now, if the strobe feature is on 1, it means you're going to see every single frame. If the strobe is on 2, you're going to see every second frame, and 3 every third frame, and so on. And if you have decimal spaces in between, you're going to get decimal reactions. So what that looks like is just a slow increase in frames, but sometimes it can create kind of like a jerky effect because it's so uneven. So what you can do to fix that is you can go into your graph editor and set a stepped interpolation modifier to your strobe filter effect, and you can set that to about 12. I find that going higher and going lower than 12 doesn't really fit. For some reason, 12 is like a sweet spot for this. I'm not saying it can't be refined even a little bit more, but 12 definitely hits the spot perfectly right there. So you have to do this with every strip. So you have to do this with every strip that has to be decreased in terms of animation. So the thinking here was to have it come in at a normal frame rate, 1:1, because it doesn't have to move very far. And then on the jumps, it reduces. And on the slide, it reduces even further. And as it slides, it goes back because it goes into the distance. And then when it is no longer necessary for it to be a noticeable 3D shape, you can let it go back to single frames, because for the animation itself, that transparency will just be moved for every frame. So in this way, you get that reduction in frame rate without the clash with the camera's motion. I'm not saying this is a perfect method by any means, but what I am saying is that this is a way that you can get past that flicker problem without too much issue. The biggest issue you would have is if you have like 100 different objects in the same scene going at different frame rates, and you would have to do meta strips for every single thing that has to be varied throughout the entire scene. So this does work, but I don't think that trying to push 3D into a 2D box is necessarily the answer. I think what needs to be held on to is the visual language that came with the 2D animation, and use those expressive elements within a 3D space to add something to the medium instead of trying to force the medium to become something that it's not. But I have to be honest, I do realize there's a weirdness to seeing something that used to be at like 4 frames per second and sometimes even just 1 frame per second, when it's just like talking heads, suddenly be full frame, full normal animation, full animation. Yikes. There's something like really weird about watching that. So I think that it's good that there's like this transitional phase to get people used to the accuracy of 3D, so that at some point the two will actually complement one another instead of trying to compete with one another. At least that's my ideal. I'm not, going to say, well, I'm the authority on this and this is the way we need to do it. No, it's just... Oh, interesting. Look at this. You can see the shadows on the monkeys back there. That's not part of the shadow pass, by the way. So anyway, this is a very cool tip there for you guys. If you want to use this with your particular animation, you're absolutely welcome to. Just remember that it does take a fair bit amount of work to get this looking right. And this does not include your compositing. If you want to do compositing with this as well, you're going to have to separately export those glares and flares and whatever else and add those over as well. So yeah, let's move on to Exodus itself. Okay, so we were somewhere around here last week where I just talked you guys through the frames that were added, but I did not yet add any dialogue or space them correctly to actually have a good idea of how long this would be. So I managed to get that done this week and start and finish actually with chapter 11. And I started with chapter 12 as well. So I'm going to play this.
I have sinned against the Lord your God, and against you. Now therefore forgive, I pray thee, my sin only this once, and entreat the Lord your God, that he may take away from me this death only. Stretch out thine hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt.
And there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days, they saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings.
Go yet, serve the Lord, only let your flocks and your herds be stayed, let your little ones also go with you. Thou must give us also sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may sacrifice unto the Lord our God. Our cattle also shall go with us, there shall not an hoof be left behind, for thereof must we take to serve the Lord our God, and we know not with what we must serve the Lord, until we come thither. Get thee from me, take heed to thyself, see my face no more, for in that day thou southeastest my face thou shalt die. Thou hast spoken well, I will see thy face again no more. Yet will I bring one plague more upon Pharaoh, and upon Egypt, afterwards he will let you go hence. When he shall let you go, he shall surely thrust you out hence altogether. Speak now in the ears of the people, and let every man borrow of his neighbor, and every woman of her neighbor, jewels of silver, and jewels of gold.
And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people.
Thus saith the Lord, about midnight will I go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sitteth upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and all the firstborn of beasts. And there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there was none like it, nor shall be like it any more. But against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog move his tongue, against man or beast, that ye may know how that the Lord doth put a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these thy servants shall come down unto me, and bow down themselves unto me, saying, Get thee out, and all the people that follow thee, and after that I will go out.
And that's it. That's where we're at. So that is chapter 10 finished and chapter 11 finished as well. And the first of chapter 12 hasn't been scanned yet. It's only like 4 frames yet. I hope you guys loved it. I know there's quite a lot more to do. The preparations for the Passover are quite specific. Have a great one, and God bless you.